When I was a young child, one of my favorite television shows to watch was The Incredible Hulk. And if you're not familiar with that story, the premise of it is a man named Dr. David Banner, who was a normal person most of the time. He was a scientist and a physician. But when he would lose his temper and get angry, he would turn into a monster, literally. In fact, the two versions of him were played by two totally different actors. And the normal version, he was just a mild-mannered, kind gentleman of a person. But when he'd get angry, he would turn green and he would become this intimidating, large, muscular, destructive monster. In the intro to the television show, whenever it would come on, there was a couple of lines that it would describe the theme of the show. It would say, when David Banner grows angry or outraged, a startling metamorphosis takes place. The creature is driven by rage. Then there'd be this video of the Incredible Hulk angry, flipping over a car. And then it would jump to a scene where you would have the normal David Banner again, but he's talking to a reporter who's probing a little too closely. And he says to him that iconic phrase, "Don't make me angry. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry." The introduction of the television show ends with David Banner telling us that he's believed to be dead, but he has to let the world think that he's dead until he can find a way to control the raging spirit that dwells within. Well, have you ever considered the fact that the premise of this television show, frankly, parallels many people's real life experiences? I mean, not only do other people not like us when we're angry, but we don't like ourselves when we're angry very much. I mean, many of us can look back at incidents in our life just yesterday or earlier this morning maybe, or last week, where we lost our temper, where we got angry and were ashamed of some things that we said. Maybe some things that we texted. Maybe it's something that we posted on Facebook to a friend about politics that we so disagreed with something they were saying that we just had to say something back, and now we're kind of ashamed that others saw it. The truth is, anger tends to turn us into something that we don't like. And for many people, their experience is that there's two different persons. The them when they're sort of having a normal day, and the them when they're angry. And the them when they're angry just in fact might be described as a creature, a hawk. All of us are forced to wrestle with the question of, how do we control the raging spirit that dwells within us? Anger. I've entitled this message, Taming the Inner Beast. And we're in the midst of a broader series entitled Unmasking the Enemy. And we've been looking at our great enemy, Satan. Satan wants to destroy every one of us. He wants to find any way he can to strip our joy, to rip away our confidence in God, to cause us to be enslaved to sin. And the reality is, Satan is a defeated foe. He is a defeated enemy. His power has completely been removed unless we believe his lies, unless we open the door of our heart to what his plans are for us and what he wants to do. If we give him permission to affect our lives in various ways. And probably the greatest, the most common avenue that Satan uses to get access into our lives is the emotion of our anger. And it's in times when we are angry that we open wide that door and allow Satan in. We allow him to affect our thoughts, to pervert our intentions, to affect how we feel, so that we say things we wouldn't otherwise say. We do things, we don't do things that we would otherwise do that we should do. The verse that I want us to look at this morning is found in Ephesians chapter 4. Two verses, really, verses 26 and 27. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there if you'd like. But Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 and 27 says this. It says, "Be angry and do not sin, and do not let the sun go down on your anger, and give no opportunity to the devil." First thing I want us to consider is this: anger is not sin. anger is not sin. Verse 26 says, be angry and do not sin. That be angry is really an invitation to do this. It's in the imperative tense. It is be angry. I think it's more of an assumption. It assumes that anger is going to be there. It's going to be a part of us at times. In many ways, anger is simply an emotion. It's pretty hard to control our emotions. We can try, we can impact our emotions, but we can't really fully control how we feel. And so, in other words, it's saying, go ahead and feel this way. However, don't sin when you're angry. In fact, not only do all people deal with anger, but the Bible tells us that God is angry. There's plenty of examples in Scripture that talk about the wrath or the anger of God. One example is found in Numbers chapter 32 and verse 13, where we read, the Lord's anger was kindled against Israel. And thus it goes on to say that he made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years until all of the generation that had done evil in the sight of the Lord was gone. You can make the case that without anger entirely, we would not be very good people. There are some things that should make us angry. A person who can't feel anger, frankly, might be sociopathic. They wouldn't mind seeing other people suffer. It wouldn't bother them to see a family member or a friend taken advantage of. Anger is a natural byproduct in response to loving certain things. When things that we love or appreciate are attacked or are taken away, it releases emotions of anger. It helps us to protect ourselves when we're under attack. It helps us to be motivated to action as warriors for good. And so anger itself is not a sin, but what the Bible does teach, and what our own experience, I think, bears out, secondly, is that anger can quickly lead to sin. And so he says here in verse 26, be angry, but do not sin. James says something very similarly in James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, where he says, he urges to let every one of us be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Why? Because anger does not produce the righteousness of God. Years ago, I remember one time when I was driving home, and as I was driving home, I was only a few miles from home, and in my rearview mirror there was this 15-passenger van, and he was just following really close. It was obvious he really wanted to get around me, and for whatever reason in the moment, it kind of bothered me a little bit because I wasn't going slow. I'm sure I was doing probably 5 miles per hour over the speed limit, and we were getting up close to an intersection, and I was going to make a right-hand turn at this four-way stop, and as I stopped, I noticed this van kind of quickly pulled into the parking lot to my right. And as I was coming to a stop and getting ready to pull out, I realized he was trying to use that parking lot to try to cut me off and get in front of me, which isn't legal, and struck me in the moment as kind of rude. And so as I pulled out from that intersection and I realized what he was doing, kind of made a split decision. I stepped on it. I was not going to let him get the satisfaction of getting in front of me. So I was able to speed past him just as he was pulling out behind me. And immediately, it wasn't even a passing zone, but he tried to get in the left lane to get around me anyways. And again, this just bothered me. This sort of felt like a competition all of a sudden. And I felt myself getting angry at him. And I thought, I'm not letting him by. And so I stepped on it. I did what any normal, rational human being would do in that moment. I stepped on it and I started going fast enough to keep this van from getting past me. And then I slowed back down once he got in behind me, not to an annoying pace, my normal pace. And once again, he tried to get out around me. And again, I decided to not let him get around me. I was upset at him. This went on for about 2.5 miles until he suddenly veered left and turned off on another road. And he honked his horn at me as he left, obviously upset at me. And in that moment, all of a sudden, it dawned on me that my heart was racing. My hands were even shaking. I was nervous. I was under the control of anger. And For the first time, I stopped to think about what I had been doing, and I asked myself, why did I care whether he got around me or not? Why did I care if he was being rude? I don't even know this guy. Let him pass me and get on ahead. But, it's amazing how anger can so quickly overcome us, and even somewhat irrational things or dumb things can cause us to get angry, and in our anger to do things we wouldn't otherwise do. The Proverbs are filled with warnings about that very thing. Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 29 tells us, whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. In other words, somebody who's quick to lose their temper, they're going to be quick to do really foolish and stupid things. Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 18 tells us that a hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger quiets contention. Again, that person who's quick to lose his temper, he's not in control of his emotion. He's going to start a lot of fights. He's going to get into a lot of arguments. Proverbs 29 and verse 22 says that an angry man stirs up dissension, and a hot-tempered one commits many sins. Anger has a way of leading us to do sinful things. And because of that, it's a natural open door for Satan to get a foothold into your life. It's an avenue where Satan, when you're angry, when something has upset you, he is able to step in, if we're not careful, and cause us, motivate us, incline us, tempt us to do some stupid things. This is why in Ephesians 4, he says in verse 27, do not give the devil a foothold into your life. In your anger, do not give the devil a foothold. Now, everybody responds a little differently to anger. And our sinful tendencies might look different from the next person. But there's really three different primary ways that people sinfully tend to respond to anger. And probably the most obvious one, the first one, is they tend to blow up. To blow up is sort of an overt display of emotion of some sort. It's the mom who yells at her kids when they frustrate her. It's the husband who explodes in anger at his wife. It's the man who hits a wall or slams a book on the desk. It's the coach who screams at the referee because he got the call wrong. It's the child who throws a temper tantrum on the floor. These are all examples of people blowing up in their anger. And this is probably the most obvious way that people display anger sinfully. But there are some other ways as well that can also be destructive, even if they're not quite as overt. If the first one could be described as blowing up, the second one I would describe as the one who lets it trickle out. This is the person who uses subtle forms of expressing anger, passive-aggressive forms of getting revenge or of lashing out at another person. This is the wife who's upset at her husband for something, and so she chooses to take her good old time getting ready because she knows it's frustrating her husband that she isn't ready yet. This is the coworker who refuses to talk or make eye contact with a person that they know has done something to them, or somebody that they're perturbed at or frustrated with or angry at, and so they won't make eye contact. They won't talk to them. They kind of talk around them. This is the friend who chooses not to return a text or a phone call to another person who didn't invite them to their party or who did something that bothered them. Or this is the person who slanders a person behind their back. They talk to other people about something this person did or things about this person that they don't like. This person may be able to control their temper in the moment of getting angry. This person might bite their tongue in the moment, but then in the time that passes after it, in the hours, the days, the weeks, even longer that go by, this person finds subtle ways to lash out. Rather than deal constructively with the situation that brought about their anger, they let their anger trickle out. Well, so some people blow up, other people let their anger trickle out. A third dysfunctional way that people tend to act in anger is they tend to shut down. This is the child who storms back to his room and just chooses to pout. Or the spouse who withholds affection from their partner because they're angry at them. This is the person who sort of internalizes those emotions. They just grow bitter and they stew internally. Interestingly, these people oftentimes will deny that they're even angry. If you ask them, hey, is something bothering you? Nope, nothing's bothering me. Nothing's wrong. Well, you seem a little off. I'm fine. These people will oftentimes ignore the reality that they're angry. Their defense mechanism is to sort of flee the whole thing, is to sort of get away from it, to suppress it. Now, this can have negative effects on other people because other people can tell that you're angry, even though you refuse to acknowledge it. And subtly, you make life difficult for them anyways, even if you're not trying to do that. But this can also have a lot of negative effects on you, the individual who suppresses that anger. And we're going to talk more about this next week, because next week we're going to look at anger's related tendency, and that is bitterness. But anger itself, one person has said that over 90% of depression is really just suppressed anger. It could be suppressed anger at other people. It might be suppressed anger at yourself because you're such a failure, because you don't get it right, because things didn't go right. It could be suppressed anger at you don't know what. It's just sort of life itself. You're angry at life. You lost a lot of money in the stock market. You a relationship that didn't work out, and you can't really figure out who to blame, and so you don't know who to be angry at, but you're just angry at life, and rather than knowing how to deal with it, you suppress it, and it just kind of foments into bitterness. It could be anger at God. But I mean, particularly for a Christian, we know it's not right to be angry with God. So how can I express anger at God? And so instead, we just sort of suppress those feelings and those emotions of anger toward God, and we get depressed. This brings us to the third point in my message this morning to you, and that is sort of a challenge that you would deal with your anger. Don't react out of anger. The Bible encourages us to deal with our anger rather than reacting out of anger. And this is what I think it means here in Ephesians chapter 4, where he says, do not let the sun go down on your anger. Now, some sort of view this literally and basically say, well, this means that I've got to make things right with somebody that I'm angry with before the sun goes down. If it's nighttime, I got to quick deal with it before I go to sleep. That's not a bad suggestion or a bad rule of thumb, but in reality, there are some situations that are more complex than that. There are some situations that just can't be resolved that quickly, where dealing with it is more than a 1-hour phone call or a 10-minute email to somebody to kind of deal with it before you go to sleep. But I think the gist of what he means, I think it's probably more of a figure of speech of don't let a lot of time go by before you deal with your anger. If you just don't deal with it, or if you react in sin, neither of those things are helpful. Both of those create an open door for Satan to get into your life and to wreak havoc. And so we can't let sin fester. We have to act on it in constructive ways. And I think James chapter 1 is probably the best passage on giving us some instructions on how to deal with our anger. Now, we don't have time to look at the broader context of James chapter 1, but interestingly, throughout the first chapter, James is speaking to people who are going through hard times, people who are experiencing real trials. And so much of what he has to say in the first 18 verses or so is he encourages them, first of all, to put their circumstances into perspective. In other words, don't allow uncomfortable, unfortunate, difficult circumstances to control your emotions. And so in verse 2 of James chapter 1, he urges them, he says, count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds. In other words, internally consider it a joyful thing. And then he goes on to talk about the benefits of trials and how despite the uncomfortableness of them, God wants to use trials in your life to produce some good things. And so he says, choose to count it joy. A little lower in verse 9, he says, let the lowly brother, or the King James, I think, says the brother of low estate. Let the lowly brother, the person of humble circumstances, boast in his exaltation. What he's saying there is he's saying, even the Christian who is poor, who has humble circumstances, things aren't going well, they can rejoice in the gospel. Because the gospel exalts them. They can rejoice in the reality that God has exalted them in an eternal sense. Eternally speaking, God has taken their low estate, their humble circumstances, and he has elevated them significantly. And so they can boast in that. They can rejoice in that. Similarly, verse 12 says, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. So blessed, happy, joyful, successful. Blessed is the one who remains steadfast under trial. So James 1 is all about telling us, encouraging us in the midst of hard situations to take a step back and examine those situations and put them in their proper perspective. One of the reasons, oftentimes, probably the most common reason you and I get angry are little things, little circumstantial things that aren't going our way, and we might not use the term angry. We might say, well, I was just bothered, or I was frustrated, or what they did annoyed me. Really, all of those things are just synonyms for anger. They might have a lesser degree implication to them, but what we're really saying is, I got a little bit angry when. I got somewhat angry over. There's a book entitled Overcoming Emotions That Destroy. One of the co-authors, Dr. Becca Johnson, who is a psychiatrist, and she was studying the emotion of anger. And let me just read a quote from that book. She says, one day I decided to keep a mental log of all the times I felt angry. I wanted to know how often I got angry, and what I got angry about, and what triggered the anger. I encourage you to try this too, she says. The results were surprising and quite humbling. I was shocked at how angry feelings came to the surface. Prior to consciously counting these episodes, I had mistakenly assumed that anger was only an occasional visitor to my emotional arsenal. I was wrong, very wrong. I had to be honest about my feelings of anger, frustration, and actual infuriation. I had felt either fits or flits of anger at not being able to find my favorite socks, running out of milk, the kids taking too long to get ready, the slow driver in front of me, the long wait at the pharmacy, the store that was closed on Monday, having to put gas in the car, the price of the gas in the car, the long line and the slow service when I had to put gas in the car, the kids leaving their clothes on the floor again, the computer freezing on me again, and I was only halfway through the day. Though some of these feelings could describe fleeting frustrations, when I was honest, far too many of them were actual anger. Then came another humbling lesson. I learned that most of the day-to-day anger I experienced was all about small, insignificant stuff that I face all the time. If we're going to learn to deal constructively with our anger, the first thing we've got to learn to do is to put our circumstances into perspective. When we feel that those bothersome annoyances kind of rousing up within us, either as a minor frustration or as a deep-seated anger, to be able to step back and kind of stop ourselves. I talked a couple weeks ago about taking every thought captive, taking every emotion captive, kind of taking those emotions of anger captive, not allowing them to just begin to have free reign in our life to sort of cause us to say and do things, but stopping them the moment we recognize them, and then passing them through that filter of truth. Wait a minute. Is this really a big deal? Does it really matter that this driver wants to get around me? Does it really matter that my kids left the clothes on the floor again? Is it really a big deal that somebody disrespected me? I mean, really, who am I? Just kind of stepping back and putting circumstances into perspective. And then related to that, but secondly, I would say is taking time to listen and think. Because James goes on in chapter 1, and he particularly addresses then this issue of anger after talking about our circumstances and the importance of keeping circumstances in perspective. In verses 19 and 20, he says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger." To be quick to hear, what's he talking about? Obviously, hearing here is more than just being cognizant of what's being said around us or the noises around us. He's talking about taking time to really listen, to pay attention, rather than just sort of exploding or saying what we want, to take the time to pause and think. And oftentimes this might require us to listen to what someone else is saying. Maybe we're getting angry at somebody else. Maybe we're getting angry at what other people are doing. And I think he's saying, take some time to listen to them. Take some time to hear them out. Take some time to try to think about their perspective. What are they going through right now? Are they frustrated and stressed at something else? Maybe they're speaking to me the way they are because of other things going on in their life. And they're not trying to be rude to me. It sure is coming across rude. And it's frustrating to me when they talk that way. But, if I take a step back and listen to what they're saying, does it help put some things into perspective? Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 9 urges us, "Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools." That person that doesn't take the time to listen to others, who just kind of reacts and responds in anger, the Bible says they're a fool. We're acting as fools when we're not willing to take that step back and reconsider those emotions and think and listen from other people's perspective. And then thirdly, what James chapter 1 tells us and urges us to do is to guard your tongue. He says, "Let every man be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to get angry." Notice the connection between being slow to speak and slow to get angry. It's almost like how quickly we speak is an indication of how quickly we're going to get angry. And I think you see evidence of this reality in Mark chapter 7. There's this interesting story of Jesus and his disciples and the Pharisees. And the Pharisees get upset at Jesus' disciples because they had broken one of their precious traditions that required everyone to wash their hands before they ate. And it wasn't so much for cleanliness, although it might have been rooted in some hygiene things, principles, but it was more rooted in the religious idea of ceremonial cleanness and uncleanness. And the Jews had various things that they would do as a show of their concern for ceremonial cleanness before God. It tended to picture the importance of having a clean heart, and so they would clean their hands before they ate. And the Pharisee says, "Why don't your disciples do this? Why do they break this important tradition?" And Jesus uses this as an important teaching opportunity, and he responds to them by saying, "Look, it's not what goes into your mouth that defiles you." In other words, a person who doesn't wash their hands and they eat, even if some of that dirt or those germs go into them, that doesn't defile them. It might make them sick, particularly as we're considering this whole coronavirus thing. It's probably an important thing for us to wash our hands regularly before we eat, before we touch other people's things. But in the big picture of things, in a spiritual sense, washing your hands doesn't have anything to do with defiling you in the truest sense, spiritually speaking. However, Jesus says, what comes out of a person, referring to their words, their mouth, what they speak about, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. And then he says, because from within the heart, or out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. Now, how many of those descriptions or descriptors tend to be mostly true of people when they're angry? Things like murder, covetousness. I want what they have. I'm angry that they have something I don't have. Wickedness, deceit, slander. We talk about people in a wrong way. Pride, when our pride has been challenged and someone has been rude to us or they've undermined our authority. All of these things tend to defile us when they come out of us. And here's the principle, is that on the one hand, our words are a reflection of what's already in our heart. Our words demonstrate how defiled our hearts already are. But the opposite is also true. Our words have the ability to further defile our hearts. That's what Jesus says. What comes out of a person is what defiles him. The way that we speak, it actually can impact our hearts negatively. And we see this with anger all the time. A person who's angry, their words reflect, wow, they're angry. But the truth is, the more we talk out of anger, typically the angrier we get. Psychiatrists used to argue that, for an angry person, the best way to deal with their anger was to vent it. Many of you have an Instapot at home and that thing builds up with pressure. And then when you're finished cooking, you have to kind of turn that little release valve to let the pressure out. And you have to be really careful because there's all of this hot steam inside. And so you get a towel or something and you put it on there and you kind of go slow and you release all of that hot pressure. Well, the theory used to be that, an angry person, if they didn't let it out, it would all just build up within inside of them and they had to find an avenue to vent. And so they, encourage them to go get a pillow and scream into it or go off by themselves in the woods and yell and talk. And it didn't take long for psychiatrists to realize that it was actually having the opposite effect. People who would vent their anger verbally, actually that anger tended to build up. But the best thing they could do would be to learn to control their words, to control their mouth, rather than venting it, even privately venting it. One of the best things they could do is learn to guard their tongue. And so this morning, I just challenge you guys and encourage you. Anger is such a big issue. Everybody deals with it. It looks different for all of us. And for many, it's a combination of the three ways in which we tend to deal with our anger. But anger is such a common avenue for Satan to get a foothold into our life. Particularly when that anger just builds up over time and we never deal with it. And it turns into bitterness. So here's what I'd like you to do. You're at home, I assume, and you're probably watching this with other people around. I'd like you guys to answer these questions together. And this is a non-judgmental zone, all right? So as you answer these questions, if one of you opens up and you acknowledge something as truthful, I don't want anyone else in the room to kind of pile on, oh, yeah, that's true. Or to kind of suggest other things that the person hasn't said yet. This is not at all a time for us to reinforce what other people are saying. This is just a time for you to be honest with others. Brainstorm a little bit possibly if you want, but answer these 4 questions. Number 1, what do you most dislike about yourself when you get angry? When you look at times in your life when you've been angry, what things are you most ashamed of or most frustrated about yourself as you see your anger and how it's impacted you? And then secondly, what are the things that typically produce anger in you? What are your triggers? What things tend to set you off in anger? And then thirdly, I'd like you to answer the question, what way or what ways do you tend to respond to anger? Are you one who tends to blow up? It just kind of all comes spewing out? Are you one that tends to let it trickle out? You kind of control it in the moment, but over time, sort of those passive-aggressive ways of letting the person know you're upset at them or even behind their back. Is that you, or are you the third one? Do you tend to shut down? Maybe you tend to deny that you even get angry, and you don't recognize what you're feeling is really anger. And then finally, fourthly, I'd like you just to talk about and try to answer the question, what could you do better to limit your sinful, angry reactions? Is it primarily a matter of you doing better at putting circumstances into perspective? To stepping back and saying, okay, this really isn't a big deal. Or for you, maybe if you get angry at people most often, maybe it's listening more. I need to do a better job of stepping back and not responding so quickly, but taking the time to listen. And to listen, thinking about what they're trying to say or what they're going through, or give them the benefit of the doubt. Or maybe it's just a matter of talking less, of learning to think for a while before you express your opinions. If you're an external processor and your tendency is just to blurt out what you think and what you feel, maybe for you it's just a matter of learning not to talk right away. But I'd like you guys to discuss those questions, and I hope you have a blessed Lord's Day.
Hey guys, Pastor Jason here. I just want to take a moment and let the kids wrap their brains around what Pastor Mike has been talking about. So he said that Jesus teaches us in our anger, don't sin. So lots of things can make us angry. Matter of fact, if you want to pause the video for a minute, kids, tell your parents some things that make you angry. Go ahead, stop the video. Okay, I'm assuming you did that. So those things happen to you and you get angry, and that's just kind of normal. We get angry. The question is, what do you do with that anger? So I've got a classic science experiment here for you. You've probably seen this in school. This is baking soda and vinegar. It's like the most basic, cool chemical reaction. When you mix these two things together, they produce carbon dioxide gas, which means it bubbles, which is kind of neat. Now, I've got the same reaction set up in two different environments here, and I'm going to show you the difference between sinning in your anger and not sinning in your anger. So, first demonstration, I've got a Ziploc baggie, and the Ziploc baggie is not stretchy. It's got vinegar right there. It's got baking soda in the top. Now, when you mix these two together, bad things are going to happen. Now, this is kind of like sinning in your anger. Something happens and you just can't handle it, and you freak out, you throw a fit, you scream and yell and punch the wall. Here's an example of what not to do. Now, the same exact reaction can have an entirely different result. Jesus was angry once, and he went into the temple and he did stuff. He threw tables over. He made a whip and drove people out, and you'd think, oh, Jesus lost it. He threw a fit. No, not really. He was doing a good thing with the anger that had built up inside him. He was actually doing God's will as an angry person. So, look at this. Same exact reaction. I've got the baking soda in the balloon here, and as the baking soda starts to go in, the vinegar reacts to it, and we're going to blow this balloon up with all of that anger. The balloon, though, notice, I hope this works. The balloon is not popping. This person is angry, but look what's happened. No explosion. Now I've got air. I've got anger, but not sin. This person didn't explode. As a matter of fact, you could do things, you could accomplish work with this anger. You could say things. And you could say things that are good, that are right, that fix the problem. Matter of fact, you could even sing praises to God. This balloon is singing. Or you could say, that's not right, you should stop that. It's not singing very well. There you go. You can accomplish work and do things in a positive way without exploding, and the anger that you feel can be used for right things. So there you go. There's a quick little demonstration. In your anger, do not sin.